guys on the other side. Greetings, everyone, and welcome to the webinar channel of the Association of Certified eDiscovery Specialists. My name is Mike Quadraro. I'm the president of ACEDS. Today, we are joined by our partner, eDiscovery Today, the wonderful, prolific Doug Austin, for a webinar entitled Unique Solutions to the Hyperlinked Files Dilemma. We'll get into the presentation in a minute. You can learn more about eDiscovery Today at eDiscoverytoday.com. Hope I got that URL right. Before we get started, please know we love questions. You can use the chat or the Q&A to submit your questions. You have the option to submit your questions anonymously if you so choose. Also, if you'd like a copy of today's slide deck, it should be available in the resource widget tab located on your screen. Without further delay, I am super excited to introduce Doug Austin, who will take the presentation from here. Doug, please take it away.
Thanks, Mike, and welcome everybody. Definitely looking forward to talking about some unique solutions for what I think has become, I think, one of the biggest challenges we're dealing with in eDiscovery today, which is the hyperlinked files dilemma. So without further ado, let's get rolling into it. Very quickly, here's what we'll be talking about today. We're going to really kind of have this in two sections. We're going to talk about all the challenges associated with hyperlinked files and how they're different from traditional attachments. We're also going to talk about some of the things that people aren't talking about with regards to hyperlinked files in terms of where some of you may think, well, gee, it's kind of this bad. Well, it may actually be even worse than you think with some of these things that people aren't talking about, and we'll get into some of those challenges as well. Then what we will do is we will switch and talk about potential solutions and what might be a different approach to the hyperlinked files dilemma and talk about some potential solutions. So we'll be going through that. One thing I will mention is we're really trying to focus on the technical stuff here. So unlike some other panels that have talked about this topic and have talked about the several case law rulings, notable case law rulings that have transpired so far, we're not going to focus on those. We may mention one or two cases during our discussion, but we're really not going to have a section dedicated for it. But we do have a resources slide in the back with links to the known cases so far, the major cases so far, that you can check out on your own. Of course, any ideas expressed by us here today are our own, not those of our organizations, clients, or partners. So if you don't like what you hear, blame us, not them. And let me introduce our speakers. And I'm going to toggle to my notes, which are normally on a separate screen. So hopefully I don't lose anybody when I do this. All right. Let me know if I do. So start with John. John Price is a principal technologist at Cloudficient. He is a seasoned eDiscovery professional and author with over 2 decades of experience bridging the worlds of business, legal, and information technology. He's devoted his career to helping organizations manage data with precision, compliance, and efficiency. Throughout his career, John has emphasized the intersection of legal frameworks, technological advancements, and practical workflows to enhance organizational capabilities in managing data. His expertise spans information governance, eDiscovery readiness, custodian and data mapping, and data collection, reflecting a deep understanding of enterprises' challenges in today's regulatory environments. Brandon D'Agostino is the Vice President of Product at Cloudficient, where he leads the development and execution of the company's product strategy, ensuring alignment with customer needs and market trends. Brandon, who's a licensed attorney, has over 15 years of experience in the legal technology industry, holding senior positions at companies like Symantec, Veritas, Proofpoint, Disco, and Ona. He's got a unique blend of legal, technical, and go-to-market experience, and he's driven significant growth and results for the products and teams he's led. He also teaches eDiscovery as an adjunct professor at the Charleston School of Law. John and Brandon co-authored the just-released book, Foundational eDiscovery, A Practical Guide to Early Case Management, which is available on Amazon and will be available at the Cloudficient booth at Legal Week. And Rich Robinson began his legal technology career in 1999 in the IT department for a large law firm in Boston, Massachusetts. He has served as a help desk specialist, manager, applications analyst, litigation support specialist, and litigation support director in large and medium-sized firms in Boston, Providence, Austin, and Dallas. Prior to joining Toyota as their Director of Legal Operations and Litigation Support, Rich worked as the eDiscovery and Information Manager at JCPenney in Plano, Texas. And I'm Doug Austin, editor of eDiscovery Today, a daily blog about eDiscovery, cybersecurity, data privacy, information governance, and AI trends, best practices, and case law. I've got over 30 years of experience providing services to the legal community, so I know a thing or two because I've seen a thing or two. And I've been daily blogging for almost 15 years, so I'm either committed or I ought to be. All right, so with that, let's talk about the challenge here and what it's all about. So, Rich, can you explain to our audience why the whole hyperlinked files thing is such a big deal?
Yeah, I at least can give a 30,000-foot view. I mean, there's lots of complexity to the question, but the primary idea is this. In the past, attachments had parent-child relationships with the email and included the entire record or document as an attachment embedded in the email as it existed at the time that it was sent. And in today's age of collaboration and collaboration platforms, we've moved into this concept of sharing links to files as they exist when they were added to the email, but allow for the continuing collaboration of the people on the email, right? So it's from a collaboration perspective, hyperlinked files make a lot of sense. From an information governance perspective, hyperlinked files make a lot of sense, right? Being able to have one version that is edited by a number of people allows us to keep volumes low, create less rot in the workspace, right? But from an eDiscovery perspective, it creates a lot of questions. Is the hyperlinked file an attachment or part of the family group? What version should be collected and shared in Discovery, right? Is it the version as it was sent at the time the email was originally sent, or is it the completed version? Should that be part of a separate eDiscovery process where you're searching the locations where hyperlinked files are being saved, as opposed to part of the collection of the email itself, right? So lots of questions that arise from it, and the reason why it's such a hot topic in the industry right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And because of the big move to the cloud, it's really blown up in recent years. Absolutely. A great discussion of that, Rich. This is really kind of what it looks like in terms of the way we typically used to send emails. As you see the example on the left, an email I sent to my personal email account with a physical embedded attachment of a blog post I wrote. And then you see that same a variation or another email sent where it's a link to the file instead. So of course, with that link to that file may be edited. Since I sent the link, it may be not even existing anymore. There's a lot of variables that can come into play with sending a link to a file, which is dynamic versus sending an embedded file, which is static. I can, sorry, get to my notes here. So John, can you talk a little bit about how the move to the cloud has impacted the frequency of hyperlinked files in organizations?
Yeah, so one of the things that Rich mentioned was the fact that IG teams are really pushing people to work this way. It's more efficient for the end users. It's more efficient for IG teams and honestly IT teams in managing that data. But there are a few other things that have come into play as well. So just the fact of moving to remote and hybrid work, pretty much every webinar from 2021 to 2023 started with the proliferation of data moving to the cloud because of remote work, and I'm guilty of doing that as well. But it's honestly an issue, right? I mean, it is happening. People are moving to ways that are more efficient, and really that sometimes involves new applications that are just easier to use. Potentially, shadow IT, which opens up a whole nother can of worms. But uh, aside from everybody just moving in that direction or being pushed in that direction, there's a couple of things that are pretty unique to the applications. So a lot of applications actually steer you toward using hyperlinked files. Anybody who has put an attachment onto an Outlook email, they're often prompted with, "Would you like to send a link?" And that is easier. A big one that a lot of people don't talk about is, my daughter tells me all the time, nobody uses email anymore. People in the corporate world, of course, still do. But I have found after she said that like when I'm working with our product team, there are a lot of things that I would write up in an email and share it with the team, and we'd all kind of collaborate and go back and forth. I find myself writing that up in Word, for example, and then sharing a link with the team, and then we instantly go over to Word. There's not a lot of email back and forth. So just the fact that all of that has changed and just the way that we're working, and in all honesty, it's just easier, and users are going to go to the path of least resistance.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I've done that with Google Files. In fact, I'll be on a meeting where we're referencing a Google file and somebody's editing it as we're having the meeting, and it's all live and real time. So definitely a different world than it used to be. So thanks for that explanation, John. So one of the things that I released when I first started talking about this issue, because I basically put out an initial, should they be produced, should hyperlink files be produced as modern attachments? And I got a lot of things all over the board in terms of what people were saying and concerns about it. So I decided to publish a blog post, which is linked at the bottom, about 5 assumptions. So I'll go through them quickly here just to hopefully frame our discussion a bit. I state that the issue relates only to hyperlink files, not all hyperlinks, because they're the ones that have blown up in this era of the cloud. Linking to, you've always been able to link to files, to websites, to what have you, but the hyperlink files have just really blown up in volume. That's why this has become a prime issue, not like an edge case like it used to be. Of course, the hyperlink files have to be in the possession, custody, and control of the responding party. And I'll walk through a scenario to illustrate how that can, play out sometimes. Let's say myself, John, and Brandon and Rich are all working on, basically working on a project. Rich has shared a file with us, and we're collaborating on it. And then let's say we have a falling out and Rich revokes our access to the file. Then John and Brandon sue me over the falling out, and they want my discovery. I can produce the emails or email discussions related to the file, but I can't produce the file from the link because I no longer have access to it. They would have to request it from Rich as a third party, which is why this issue probably will drive up non-party and third-party subpoenas, because you're going to see more data not available from the primary producing party. The third assumption is a file that no longer exists can't be produced. And of course, you're thinking, duh, but that's a real challenge with this. A file may no longer be available. It may not, access to it may not be available, or the version of the file that was sent may not be available. So these are things that people have to understand with regards to to the issue. 4 is I state that the file should still be produced if they're deemed to be responsive, even if it's, when we get to proportional and 5 here in a moment, I'll touch on that. But when we talk about the files, if they are in prime, data sources and they are independently responsive, they should probably still be produced. Whether or not you can link them to the email is another challenge. That could, that gets into proportionality. But still, the thing is you should be producing responsive data, and if they're available at least independently, you should be producing them. And then, of course, 5, the discovery of hyperlinked files must be both relevant and proportional. And that's been the crux of a lot of the disputes, is the proportionality of this. And it's, it's the question of can we and can we do so proportionally? So that's really becomes one of the big challenges there. So Brandon, do you think most organizations agree with these assumptions, or do you think there's still a lot of confusion about what hyperlinked files really entail?
Yeah, so I think I think generally if we put all of these on a slide and we asked people, they would nod their heads and agree. And in a conversation like this, I think people would say yes, we agree with those assumptions. I think in practice, we've done ourselves a bit of a disservice by using phrases like modern attachment that kind of infers relevance and connection to the email. And which version, again, right? Like that's not an answerable question, and using that phrase. So I would say number one for sure. Number two, the only thing to watch out for there is, yes, if in this scenario you described, if Rich removes access, then absolutely we can't get to it, or you wouldn't be able to produce it. But I think we need to watch out in situations where you might have an agency relationship where there's some control exerted by the producing party. And so there might be some unique things that could pop up, some edge cases around that. But generally, I would say yes. And then, on the third one, I think one of the things we'll talk about when we talk more about the technology and the solutions, and as the webinar goes on, is that when it ceased to exist is important, because one of the things that tends to happen in this, one of the issues we have is that we don't realize sometimes that there were hyperlink references and files until you get to review, and at that point, that custodian who shared that information, or that custodian's OneDrive or that SharePoint site, was not part of the initial preservation effort, and so now we've got to go back and say, okay, well, when was it deleted? Were we under an obligation to preserve that? Should we have known that data source should have been preserved? So it gets tricky. I think, I know we've always used in eDiscovery this parent-child relationship, right? So we talk about document families. Hyperlinks really are references to a file versus being a true attachment. And so I think of them almost as nieces and nephews, maybe cousins. They're part of the extended document family, but it's still, that reference puts us on notice that there is a potentially relevant document that should be reviewed for relevance, right? And so anyway, yeah, I think generally we would agree with those, but I think we have to be very careful about the terminology we use when we're talking about these things, so that we don't automatically assume something that's not true.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and you said they should be, and we'll get back to you on that here in a slide or so, because we asked the question in the 2025 State of the Industry report for the first time, should hyperlinked files be treated as modern attachments? Now, we didn't ask it just as a simple yes/no question. We provided 2 yes and 2 no options in response to the survey. Our 2 yes options were, yes, all hyperlinked files should be produced for relevant responsive emails. The second yes was only relevant and responsive hyperlinked files should be produced for relevant responsive emails. The 2 no options were, no, they shouldn't be produced with the emails, but they should be produced separately if they're independently relevant and responsive. And the second no was the draconian, no, they shouldn't be produced at all in any form, and so forth. So what do you all think? Is it 50-50 in terms of the yeses versus nos? In fact, it is not. Almost 3 out of 4 respondents felt that hyperlinked files should be produced as modern attachments for relevant responsive emails. And it's notable that nearly half of respondents, or close to half, said they should be produced, but only if they're also relevant responsive. So very interesting results there. So Rich, are you surprised by these numbers? And what do you think about the fact that almost half of respondents think hyperlinked files should be treated as modern attachments and be produced, but only if they're also relevant and responsive? Oh, you're muted. No, sorry, Rich. There we go.
Sorry. I'm not sure that I'd say I'm surprised by the response. I do fall into the category maybe somewhere between hyperlinked files should not be produced with relevant responses, but they should be produced separately if they're independently responsive, relevant and responsive. And yes, they should be produced for relevant and responsive emails, but only if the hyperlink files are relevant and responsive. The problem with that, though, is in order to get to that bottom orange level, you have to have collected them all in the review, in the collection phase, right? So in order to determine, to produce with, but only if it's relevant, you would have had to have done the you'd have to have done the work to collect it as part of the collection phase. And I'm not sure that that it's necessary. My thought is that it really depends on the case and the data that's involved in the case, and that litigation support teams and managing counsel should be aware of what the data looks like, or try to be as much aware of what the data looks like, and whether or not that content is going to be responsive, and whether we should plan for it in advance. Because I do think that, you know, if I'm searching Doug's email, I'm also probably searching Doug's OneDrive, and I'm going to collect the relevant and responsive stuff that's relevant to the keywords, if that's how I'm running my search, right? I'm going to collect the links that Doug sent as part of that process most of the time. I think that that's the key that you have to take into account when you're looking at these is, you know, what effort is required, and does the effort fit the proportionality issues of the case?
Yeah, absolutely. Every case is different, and that's a great point. So Brandon, you provided a thought leader observation, and part of that's shown at the bottom of the slide. Why do you think some people don't feel that hyperlink files should be produced with messages? Do you think it's because of the difficulty and proportionality considerations, or something else?
Yeah, so I think, yeah, I kind of typical attorney fashion, I just changed the question in my answer. So, and because I think saying that they should be produced is a bit of a leap, right? I think what we should do is see, can we facilitate the review of those for relevance, right, independently? And I think that's you know, the 44.8% response only if they're also responsive. And you know, I think that if organizations are saying no, on the one hand, that's probably driven largely by the fact that it can be incredibly burdensome, especially in, you know, depending on what type of technology the organization is using. It can be incredibly expensive, manual effort to go through and match up things like contemporaneous versions. And so I think that's driving a lot of it, as we see over the next, you know, 9 to 12 months, and technology does improve, both at the source and with you know, third-party solutions. Then I think people will relax that feeling a little bit and say, okay, maybe we should be reviewing those, because as we mentioned before, it is a reference to a document that, if you know, referred to in a responsive email, is most likely responsive itself. And so we need to take a look at it and make sure. And I would say that the technology, as I was looking at my notes, the technology doesn't determine whether or not to produce. It's it simply enables a more reasonable proportional approach to reviewing it for relevance, right? So as
Sure.
technology becomes better, as we get the ability to take a look at these, and it doesn't require manual effort, and it's more like the way that we handle emails with regular attachments, I think the tide will start to shift more towards, yeah, we should be producing them if they're responsive.
Sure. And of course, should and can are two different things. And that's one of the things, obviously in a perfect world, we should. But then the question is, can we? And that's where we're going to get into some of the challenges here. And one of the things we're going to do is we're going to really talk about some of the things people aren't talking enough about. So I think it's notable to kind of get into some of this. So one of the things that I think people really, when they talk about the whole challenge here, and yeah, very, very nice graphic there, eDiscovery solution, but it's the best I could do. But the people really tend to talk about things in two kind of terms. They'll talk about Microsoft email, and they'll talk about Google, Gmail, and they'll talk about Microsoft, of course, maybe linking to in an organization to SharePoint files or OneDrive or maybe Teams. In Google, they're linking to Google Drive and Google Vault. So, this is what I think a lot of providers are trying to address. They're trying to address the Microsoft and the Google scenarios. I guess, Rich, you talk to a lot of industry professionals out there. Are they talking much about hyperlink files from messaging platforms like Slack, Teams, or other platforms, or are they pretty much just talking about the issues in terms of these two?
Well, I think you're hearing mostly about these two, right? Because those are the leaders in the industry in terms of where the volume is coming from, right? But I am hearing about hyperlink files in Slack and Teams as well. I mean, the whole concept of hyperlink files comes from the concept of collaboration, that you send the file so that you send a linked version so that people on the email or on the Teams channel or on the Slack channel can collaborate and work on that file. And then, so the Slack and the Teams options are certainly geared more towards a collaborative environment. So that's what we're seeing more and more of, these linked files in Teams chats and in Slack channels and another medium.
Yeah, and so to help illustrate that point, here's some scenarios we're seeing. It's not just Microsoft accessing Microsoft and Google accessing Google. It could be Outlook messages with links to Google Drive or Google Vault files. That's one of the cases that's in the resources slide in Ray StubHub. That was the situation they were in, which was complicating their retrieval of hyperlink files in that situation. Of course, Teams is a collaboration app. So people are sending messages via Teams with hyperlinked files, or Slack. There's 300-something million users of Teams and 40-something million users of Slack. And so they're all over organizations. But then there's also all these other platforms. And I uncovered cases with these in organizations, Snapchat and Bloomberg and WhatsApp, Telegram, and even in China, WeChat. There's as many applications as you can think of that are all, the similar scenario, all have hyperlink files, all communicating. And believe me, I thought about trying to draw lines to all these different sources and even adding sources, and I thought, I give up. I think that it's going to become a very busy screen. Not that it's not already. So yeah, these are the challenges we're running into. So John, what advice do you have for our audience regarding just how widespread hyperlink files are in their organization?
So I think a lot of people on this call, I know I wouldn't mind going back 10 years ago to where your slide was at the beginning, where there was a data map of 2 things, and they may
Right.
have branched off to 2 more. That's not the case anymore, obviously, as you started to build this out. So I think it all comes down to efficient data mapping. And really, it is getting legal to break down the silos and pull in cross-functional teams with IT, with InfoGov, and really get an understanding of, you're not just using this platform, but where is this platform branching out to other platforms? And, that planning can consist of, reviewing the current data map, even potentially looking at like audit logs to see, having IT look at audit logs to see where those platforms are reaching out to other platforms and where they're making other calls. And then even going through like a sample collection. So, once you truly understand how widespread the usage is, then you can start to examine how each of those platforms, excuse me, treats the hyperlinks, the reference files, the versions, etc. And some of those solutions may be within its own ecosystem, but some of them may require third party to kind of bridge that gap and make that leap.
Yeah, absolutely. Getting some great questions and great discussion here. Definitely going to try to circle back to several of these, but I'll throw one out now to the panel. Since Mike posed it, how might the issue of produce information as maintained in the ordinary course of business, which is part of the FRCP, play into the debate on whether or not we must produce hyperlink files? Any of you have a thought on that one?
I'm not sure that it changes the scope of our conversation at all. I think that's certainly part of the discussion, is trying to produce documents as they're kept in the ordinary course of business.
Yeah, well, and I mean, let's face it, when we've already been kind of producing, I mean, when we produce Outlook, we don't produce it as a PST file or what have you. There's always like what we call the near native form, even if we're producing that way. So certainly I think that's, a consideration here, but a great question. I am going to try to move us on a little bit, but circle back to some of these other great questions because we are a little behind. And I'll move to the next thing that's a challenge that people aren't talking about enough, which is what I term the preservation nightmare. Essentially, I'll walk through a scenario here to try to illustrate that. So let's say Sarah Davis is an M365 user at an organization, which happens to be the name of the sample custodian they use in their documentation. So I'll use it. Of course, she has email, and she has files in her OneDrive for Teams and her SharePoint. So a case comes up and she's a custodian. That's going to be part of the case. So M365 provides a nice capability to select a custodian, add them to the case, include their mail, their Teams, their OneDrives, or SharePoint, and basically you add them to the case, and that's putting them on, putting them on hold. And so, great, right? So her email's locked down, the files she's linking to are locked down, everything's fine, right? Well, here's the problem with that. That's locking down the files she sends. It's not locking down the files that are sent to her. And we have all these other potential custodians that are, and probably many more, that are corresponding with her and are linking to files in their, in their data collections. So they are sending files to Sarah. Those are not being preserved when you're putting Sarah on hold. So what does that leave you? That leaves you potentially one of 2 things. You put them all on hold, which of course then becomes, I mean, just completely, out of control and almost organization wide if you kind of continue to extend it out. Or you have to, even though the trend has been towards preservation in place, because preservation in place isn't totally preserving in place like everything it needs to, you're back to collect to preserve to make sure you get it all. So these are the challenges in the preservation nightmare associated with hyperlinked files. So So Rich, you know, given there are or may be potential preservation challenges, even with a platform like M365, how should professionals handle this to ensure they're meeting their preservation obligations?
It comes back to that same advice I gave in the beginning, and that's be aware of the of your custodians and how they interact with data and how they create records. And you know, early case interviews are helpful in understanding where the data resides, and how your custodians are actually creating and collecting and preserving their own data. But that's, you know, I think a big part of it. Also, early meet and confers in a case can really help figure out where your opposing counsel is going to be coming at from in terms of hyperlinked attachments and other issues around the data. So understanding, you know, where your fights are going to be is probably worth it. But that, you know, again, it all comes down to a proportionality question. You know, if the needs of the case and the cost of the case is not worth the collection of all these materials, then you shouldn't be doing it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I kind of feel like I should almost end each of these slides with womp womp, because it just seems to continue to get worse. But we'll take a look at another challenge here. So John, could you quickly describe the 3 buckets of hyperlinked files and what our audience needs to know about them?
Yeah, so and we've kind of touched on some of this already, but typically when you go to look for a referenced file, you will find that you run into issues either with versions or availability, one of those two. So with versions, typically what you'll run into is you'll only have one version available. That may be the as sent version, or it may just be the current version. Depends on the technology that you're using to either store that data or retrieve that data upon collection. If multiple versions do exist, then it comes down to a question of what do we collect? You know, there's a potential of collecting or over collecting. If somebody put in the chat a little bit ago about Google's collection, you know, everybody has different thresholds of how many versions they store. It could be 500, it could be 100, it could be 30 days, it could be, you know, so every platform is different. So a lot of times people will just extend that retain or the versioning policy out and say keep everything. Well, if you want to produce everything, you're producing hundreds and hundreds of copies of that file. When it comes to broken links, you know, deleted files, basically accessibility. Looking at how you're collecting the data, whether you're doing a manual process or even a third-party tool that impersonates the user, you know, you could run into issues where if permissions were revoked, the file has rolled off of retention, you know, potentially, then of course you're going to have some issues collecting those as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So more challenges with hyperlinked files. And I'll get into one more that I think not everybody really thinks about, that I wrote about last week. What is exactly contemporaneous? Is it the as sent version, or is it really about who knew what when? So walking through a scenario quickly here, let's say a file sent from Joe to Sarah on December 21st. No argument, that's the as sent version, but she's on vacation, so she doesn't get around to seeing the email for a few days. During that time, the file's modified 2 or 3 times before she gets a chance to look at it. So from her perspective, what reflects who knew what when is the contemporaneous version, the time it was sent, received, or the version at the time it was first opened. So which version reflects what she knew and when she knew it? It's really the version that when she first opened it. That's the version that's truly contemporaneous from her perspective. By the way, the term contemporaneous was coined by Judge Cisneros in the In Re Uber case. And she both referenced it as synonymous with assent, but also mentioned the importance of understanding who knew what when. So to me, I think that's really a valid question. And then when you extend this a little further, if the file has been updated several times and accessed several times by both of them, really multiple versions of the file could support that inference of who knew what when. So multiple versions could conceivably be argued as contemporaneous. So definitely something to to consider from that standpoint. One last thing I'll mention here is we always talk about this issue in terms of litigation, and proportionality and all the things that we're used to. But I put up this chart from the 2025 State of the Industry report to illustrate we do eDiscovery and so many other things. And hyperlink files are going to be an issue in that. They're going to be, you're going to be needing to get to them in investigations or in regulatory responses or in HSR second requests or what have you. And there's going to be some different considerations because proportionality may not be the same when you're talking about the FTC saying, I need you need to produce these files. The burden may be considered a little bit differently. So something to think about there. Rich, in your discussions with folks, are they talking about the need to retrieve hyperlink files to support use cases other than litigation?
Absolutely. Right. eDiscovery workflows and technology have been leveraged for years to support privacy and cybersecurity responses, second requests, InfoGov, right? So all of the hyperlink files comes into play in all of those issues. And so certainly these questions are coming up when we're talking about, how to respond to a DSAR and the like. So yes, it's something that spans not just the eDiscovery space, but other areas as well. And it pays to be to have relationships with other business units within the organization, as well as your partners externally, to stay on top of what's happening and make sure you're brought to the table when the questions arise.
Yeah, absolutely. Great point. So I think we've thrown enough challenges at you. Let's talk about maybe a little bit of a different way to look at this. So John, keep talking about finding answers within eDiscovery solutions. Is that the right place to look? And is there maybe a different way to look at the problem?
Yeah, I think it comes down to a combination of what we talked about earlier, best practices, but technology, but not just technology around eDiscovery and collection. So technology starting with foundational eDiscovery. So if you look at just typical best practices for early stage eDiscovery, having the ability to manage hyperlinks and the reference files proactively, either by information governance or tools that supplement information governance. So, can we see hyperlinked files, hyperlinks, and then capture the correct versions of those proactively? Enhance custodian management to include proper data mapping. So again, potentially using technology to enhance what we know when we go to do interviews, where data is and who's using what data, et cetera. Ensuring proper preservation of hyperlinks, reference files. Again, being able to have a solution that doesn't necessarily fall to the native retention version limits, et cetera. So you don't run into, if the contemporaneous version was the first, second, or third item that was sent, what happens if it rolls off? So, you don't want to necessarily set legal hold on everything, right? And then, evaluate your collection software. So finally we get to collection. Finally we get to the eDiscovery portion. And then this is one of the things that I love about Cloudficient, and one of the reasons that I came here is being able to combine all of these things and do a lot of the work proactively. And then once it comes to collection, not only being able to collect files or even just versions in particular, but maybe even determine who saw what and when. So combining all of those three or all of those four together, I think is the key. And I think Brandon will probably go into specifics on all of those.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, like I've been saying with assumption number 3, we covered several slides back. You can't collect what isn't there. There's no eDiscovery only solution to this problem, because they are not going to be able to collect files if they're not available to collect. So that's why, yeah, I mean, we have to look at this differently. We have to look at this before you get to the eDiscovery phase. So yes, Brandon, let's talk about that. And I will just go ahead and kind of go through the animations here as you kind of talk about the solutions that you all are offering at Cloudficient and how they can help with this challenge.
Yeah, great. Well, let's get started with the first is Expiron. So to John's point, this really is a source data issue as much as it is a collection or preservation issue. And with Expiron, it's our cloud archive technology. What we allow you to do is actually retrieve the as sent version while we're journaling the email stream. So essentially, we're getting a copy of the emails as they're sent. Detect that hyperlink, we go and fetch it and store it with the message. Not forcing it to be an attachment per se, but preserving the relationship between that email or a chat message where that hyperlink file may have been shared. And then the other thing with an archive solution that can do this and is hyperlink aware, you can support those sort of heterogeneous environments where you might have some of that cross-platform document retrieval that you showed on the spaghetti slide with all the arrows and all the new platforms and stuff. That's, if you're, I mean, I know there are organizations that are using both Microsoft and Google document repositories, and they have Slack, and you have Jira and all these other tools, right? So it becomes a challenge to handle this, and by handling it early, and you might think we're storing too much, or why do we want to make additional copies? But it ends up being less expensive to handle it on the front end than it does later on when you have all of these one-off workflows where you're going back and kind of cranking up the collection and preservation machine, hoping that the documents are still there. We'll go to the next one, and then we'll go into these in a little bit more detail, but I just want to get through the portfolio first, and then we'll move on to a couple more slides. So Case Fusion is our eDiscovery platform that is it does connect with Expiron, but it also supports other data types and other data sources. But it really handles everything from identification through preservation and collection. So from an identification standpoint, as John mentioned, that custodian mapping, understanding who is who in the organization, but being able to pull in other information like audit logs to understand what people are accessing, who they're interacting with, to combine with HR systems and develop a true interactive data map that can be supplemented with manual information from custodian interviews, as well as dynamic information that we're getting from the environments that people are connecting to. And that just creates this sort of institutional memory. And then, in the situation, one that we didn't talk about was an M&A situation where you acquire a company with lots of hyperlink references to things that may or may not exist, right? And the beauty of Case Fusion is that we can ingest information from those repositories before they get sunset, so that we can add to that institutional memory and layer that on top of what you already have, and then being able to collect those hyperlink documents dynamically. And then the last one is very interesting. And this was actually part of the inspiration for this product was actually comments that Doug made at one point about, no one's thinking about the receiving party in this. Who's supporting them? Because they're getting handed a production that potentially has lots of hyperlink references, and they have no idea until they get into review typically where they are, if they're relevant. Are they, of their key custodians, how many hyperlink references are in their documents? So Hyperwise is a product that will do a scan essentially of the production, of the load file in the production, and be able to detect those, even with the native email files, be able to detect the hyperlink files that are hyperlink references. If there is no relationship information, then we'll log those and be able to produce a report. So in the case of like a situation like NRA Uber, where you have the court saying, okay, there's going to be a certain number of these contemporaneous versions that you have to go get, knowing it's manual, how do you decide, right? It's almost like skimming a privilege log. Like I'd be able to look at the metadata and the information about those files and say, okay, these are the top 100 that I really care about. So if I have to go back and I can only get some of them, Hyperwise will be able to tell you which ones that you want to go get. So that's a quick overview of the portfolio. I guess let's jump to the next slide.
Okay.
I try to save time.
And I'm sure we'll be talking about royalties after, the webinar here. I'm just
Oh,
kidding.
yeah. Talk to Peter about
Right, exactly. All right. So talk about Expiron here.
Yeah, so how does this work, right? How does Expiron do this? Imagine this is all happening, internal, and we'll use Sarah and Joe since those were Doug's examples earlier. So Sarah sends an email to Joe. That email has a reference to a SharePoint document, and there are multiple versions of the document in SharePoint. We want the as sent version. And the interesting thing about going back to the contemporaneous version problem is there isn't really, a flag or a marker on that version that says this is the one that was sent when Sarah sent her email, right? It exists at that time, right? It's the version that was active at the time she sent the message. So what Expiron will do is when we get that message, we say, okay, it has a hyperlink. Let's follow the hyperlink because we're connected, into the M365 environment. Let's go get the version that is closest to the sent date and time of the email. And this happens within a minute or two. So generally, you're not going to run a situation where the file's not there. We're going to grab that, we pull it in. And in this case, we create a relationship within Expiron to store that and preserve it. And no matter which custodian, Sarah or Joe, you preserve on legal hold and Expiron, they're both going to be associated with that conversation, with that email. And so it kind of deals with that preservation challenge that you were talking about earlier, Doug, where you have, I put Sarah on legal hold, or I put Joe on legal hold. I don't have access potentially to documents that were, say, in Sarah's OneDrive or some other repository. All right, let's jump to the next slide, and I'll go through case fusion. So this is another scenario where you may have, say you don't have Expiron, you didn't handle this in an information governance manner earlier. And so in the same case, this is where, maybe also Sarah is sending a template. So imagine it's a breach of contract case. Sarah is the sales leader sending Joe the template of the deck that's going to be presented at the sales meeting, and representations are made. Joe edits all this and does a bunch of work in this deck. Sarah had not put any of that information in the original version. So the as sent version really wouldn't have contained the information that was relevant that Joe presented to the customer, making all kinds of false claims and, product information. What we would do is capture the email, we'll collect the email. We'll know both from audit log information who accessed which files when, and also that there's a hyperlink in the email. So you would get the contemporaneous as sent version, and then also the accessed versions by both Sarah and Joe, and then making a determination of, how many versions do you get? You don't want to necessarily collect 100 versions of a document. And so being able to use a data mapping tool to build your collection job to say, okay, these are the ones that I want to actually get. and then those being stored in a preservation store connected to Case Fusion, so you could then pass them downstream for review.
Sure. Great overview, Brandon. I did want to save time for some questions, and we do have a few minutes, so I'm going through. First of all, tremendous kind of comments and chat going back and forth. Some people are asking questions. Some people are, providing some back and forth. I think that's great. I mean, this is exactly the type of thing that we wanted this to be interactive, and I've lost count of how many chat messages we have here, but I will try to pick a few. One question was about the survey respondents. How many of the survey respondents, back to the survey question, were parties that have large production obligations? Don't know the answer to that. I do have a sense that, let's put it this way, law firms and corporates were two of the largest respondent groups. And I'm sure some of the service providers are supporting them, but we didn't specifically, because we don't try to ask people a million questions. We try to keep the survey simple. We don't have breakdowns on that. But again, I think, that survey question is a should question, not a can question. So I think some people do feel like it should be, even though they acknowledge that the can and the proportionality considerations are a challenge. Let me find here's a question. What are thoughts on the parties agreeing to a certain number of links a party would try to collect and review? Any thoughts? Rich, your thoughts about, something like that?
Yeah, I think that's an option. I think the key is that you have to understand before you go into negotiating an ESI protocol, you have to understand what technology is available to you, right? You don't want the nightmare scenario where you've agreed to collect contemporaneous versions of hyperlinked files, only to find out that the version of whatever software you have doesn't have the ability to do that, right? So that for me is the key, understanding what the proportional needs of the case are, and then understanding your technology. If you don't have that understanding, kick that can down the road. Tell them we'll meet and confer and discuss later, but do not agree to anything that you aren't sure that you're able to do.
Yeah, no, great point. So here's a question. Are hyperlink files not categorized as attachments because the technology to collect contemporaneous versions, at least what we talked about, earlier, don't exist? Or are hyperlink files not attachments even if the collection technology existed? I think that's a question of, it's almost a chicken and egg thing. Certainly I think there's been arguments, and some of the case law, most of the cases have said they're not attachments. At least the judges have said that. However, I think those judges were influenced by the difficulty and the proportionality of treating them as attachments. So then the question becomes, if the technology improves, do we start seeing cases where they say, no, it is proportional now? I don't know, and I think we'll see. Any thoughts on that from any of you?
Yeah,
All right, we'll move on. Oh, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say real quick, I think from a technology standpoint, what you've seen today in other areas is the technology is catching up. So I do think that there will be some changes in that regard for sure.
Right.
As the burst lowers,
okay.
So too does the proportionality equation, right?
Right. Exactly. Well, and I mean, let's face it, some aspects of email didn't used to be the slam dunk that they are today when we first started trying to address email. A question here, what about non-organizational hyperlink files, Dropbox, iCloud, etc.? What responsibility would exist to collect and to attempt to collect and preserve those? My position is, it comes back to possession, custody, and control. If it's outside of an organization's purview, no pun intended, then that's not their responsibility. Yes, you will link to files that could conceivably be out of there, but that's not necessarily their responsibility to go to those. I think that's what we're trying to do, is get to focus on more of the organizations within an organization's control and the files in those, and not so much the outside focused areas.
Yeah, Doug,
Yeah.
the only thing I would add there is to be careful, and this comes back to the kind of the information governance side of the house is um, if those sources, because you have hybrid employees and you kind of have this sort of work-life integration going on, if those are routinely being used for business purposes, whether or not they're sanctioned by IT, I think there could be a situation where you might have to go and fetch those, but it would probably be an edge case. But just something to watch out for as we see more and more employees resorting to consumer technology just for convenience sake. Um, texting from the ball field, with the kids' practice, or storing things in their personal iCloud because it was easier to download on their phone and share it really quick in a text message. Like those types of things, we need to be cognizant of and understand maybe in those custodian interviews, how much are those things being used for business purposes.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things I've continued to try to point out, if you are a requesting party, probably you're going to need to request from more non-parties and third parties, because that may be where the data is for some of them. And I think we've seen a couple of cases with mobile devices where they've requested it from the organization. People have BYOD devices. Courts have said not in their possession, custody, and control. But what they've done is also issued direct subpoenas to the custodians themselves, and in a couple of cases have had those subpoenas granted to get it from straight from the custodians. So I definitely think there's an approach there. And I'm trying to scroll through the chat, but every time someone throws in a message, it keeps losing my place. So I think we're going to leave it at that. I'll address one more comment from Craig Ball where he said, "Hey, let's focus on email. And I understand where you're coming from, Craig. And email is still the #1 important and primary thing we're dealing with. But I definitely think right around the corner are all these other data sources, and I think you've got to start thinking about those too, even if you prioritize the focus on solutions for email first." So that's my thought on the subject. And Mike, first of all, I'll say thanks to the panelists for a great job talking about all these issues. Thanks to all of you for great questions and great discussion on the chat. And now, Mike, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Doug. And what a lively discussion. I love it. Thank you, everyone, for joining us on the ACEDS webinar channel. We are out of time. Thank you, Brandon. Thank you, John. Thank you, Rich. And of course, Doug Austin and eDiscovery Today for sponsoring our webinar today. Great presentation, great conversation. Please, everyone, visit aceds.org for a complete list of upcoming webinars. Have a great day, everyone. And as always, be kind to one another.
Bye, everybody.